Hello class, I thank Dr. Francis for the opportunity to bring to you another episode of the difference between linear active and multi-active cultures. Today we are going to hear about Sven and Antonio. Sven is a Swedish businessman living in Lisbon, Portugal. A few weeks ago he was invited by a Portuguese acquaintance, Antonio, to play tennis at 10 a.m. Sven turned up at the tennis court on time and ready to play. Antonio arrived half an hour late in the company of a friend, Carlos, from whom he was buying some land. They had been discussing the purchase that morning and had prolonged the discussion, so Antonio had brought Carlos along in order to finalize the details during the journey. They continued the business while Antonio changed into his tennis clothes, with Sven listening to all they said. At 10:45, they got on the court, and Antonio continued the discussion with Carlos while hitting practice balls with Sven. At this point, another acquaintance of Antonio's, Pedro, arrived to confirm a sailing date with Antonio for the weekend. Antonio asked Sven to excuse him for a moment, and he walked off the court to talk to Pedro. After chatting with Pedro for 5 minutes, Antonio resumed his conversation with the waiting Carlos, and eventually turned back to the waiting Sven to begin playing tennis at 11. When Sven remarked that the court had only been booked from 10 to 11, Antonio reassured him that he had phoned in advance to rebook it until noon. No problem. It will probably come as no surprise to you to hear that Sven was very unhappy about the course of events. Why? He and Antonio live in two different worlds, or to put it more exactly, use two different time systems. Sven belongs to a culture which often uses linear active time. That is, he does one thing at a time in the sequence he has written down in his date book. Antonio had disorganized Sven's day. Portuguese people, like Antonio on the other hand, follow a multi-active time system. That is, they do many things at once, often in an unplanned order. Multi-active cultures are very flexible. If Pedro interrupted Carlos's conversation, which was already in the process of interrupting Sven's tennis, this was quite normal and acceptable in Portugal. It is not acceptable in Sweden. Multi-active people do not like to leave conversations unfinished. For them, completing a human transaction is the best way they can invest their time. But what about Sven's lunch at 12:15? Not important, says Antonio. It's only 12:15 because that's what Sven wrote in his calendar. If Sven had not been disorganized by Antonio, he would undoubtedly have played tennis, eaten at the right time, and done some business. But Antonio had had breakfast, bought some land, played tennis, and confirmed his sailing plans all by lunchtime. He had even managed to rearrange the tennis booking. Sven could never live like this, but Antonio does all the time. What about you out there in class? Are you more like Antonio or are you more like Sven?